The boy was 11, pushing his mother's wheelchair through the cold drizzle outside a shuttered laundromat. She couldn't move her legs or her left arm, her words a slur only he understood. A cardboard sign, anything helps. People averted their eyes. Then his whisper cut through the wet air. No one helps us. Inside the repair shop next door, three Hell's Angels heard every word. They stepped out and the boy flinched, shielding her, but the lead biker knelt. He didn't offer pity, he asked questions. Over the next hour, the whole devastating picture came into focus. A massive stroke had stolen her body. A landlord had thrown them onto the street. A father had simply vanished. And one child, not even a teenager, was fighting the entire world alone, armed with nothing but a cardboard sign and a love fierce enough to whisper the truth that no one else would hear. His name was Caleb, though nobody on that stretch of sidewalk had bothered to ask. 11 years old, thin as a slip of paper, with shoulders set square against a world that had been crumbling for over a year. It started when his mother, a home health aide named Tanya, collapsed in their kitchen while fixing his breakfast. A massive hemorrhagic stroke. She survived, but it left her paralyzed on her left side, unable to walk, her speech a garbled stream only her son could decipher. The medical bills swallowed everything. Then the landlord, a man named Frank DeMarco, posted an eviction notice on their door 2 weeks after she came home from the hospital. He cited nuisance complaints from neighbors about the ambulance visits. Caleb's father, a man who had already been drifting, simply disappeared one Tuesday morning, leaving a note that said, "I can't do this." And so, at age 10, Caleb became his mother's sole caregiver, protector, and provider. He learned to lift her from the bed to the wheelchair, to bathe her, to decode the sounds she made. He sold their furniture. He dropped out of 5th grade. And every morning he pushed that wheelchair miles across town to busy intersections and strip malls, holding a sign he'd scrawled with a black marker, "Anything helps. God bless." Most days they got nothing but averted eyes. Some days $1. One time, a police cruiser rolled up and told them to move along because they were scaring off customers at the gas station. This was their life. This was the entire picture. And on this particular afternoon, the cold October drizzle soaking through his thin hoodie, he'd reached the edge of something he couldn't name, a cliff inside himself where hope just stopped. Directly next door to the laundromat stood Angelo's Transmission Repair, a greasy little shop with a faded sign and a pit bull named Lugnut sleeping by the door. Inside, 3 men waited for a blown gasket on a custom Harley to be patched. They were Hell's Angels, members of the Oakland chapter, riding east on a charity run for a fallen brother's widow. The trip had been hard, the weather miserable, and now their bikes were dead in the water for at least an hour. The one called Smoke, a welder with a graying beard and a tattoo of his daughter's name across his throat, sat on an overturned bucket, sipping bad coffee. Next to him, a former Army medic they called Doc was scrolling through his phone, and the third, the chapter president known as Big Mike, a mountain of a man who ran a construction company back home, was packing. They were tired, soaked, and invisible in the way men like them always are, feared, avoided, never seen. Through the open bay door, they could see the laundromat's concrete overhang and the 2 figures huddled there. The boy had just straightened the blanket over his mother's legs. A businesswoman walked past, glanced at them, and crossed the street. A few minutes later, 2 teenagers hurried by, laughing, and one kicked the cardboard sign without breaking stride. The boy picked it up, smoothed it, and held it higher. No one helped. The drizzle thickened. And then, so quiet it barely carried over the hum of the traffic, the boy looked down at his mother and whispered, "No one helps us." The words slipped through the gap between the buildings. Inside the shop, Smoke's hand stopped mid-sip. Big Mike's packing halted. Doc looked up from his phone. The 3 men exchanged a long, silent glance. What happened next would shatter every stereotype, remake a family, and prove that sometimes angels wear leather and ride chrome. Because Big Mike set down his coffee, walked to the door, and pushed it open. The boy flinched hard. In one instinctive motion, he stepped in front of his mother's wheelchair, spreading his thin arms wide as if to stop whatever was coming. The cardboard sign fluttered to the wet concrete. His chin came up, eyes blazing with a defiance that looked almost comical on a child who barely cleared 5 feet. Big Mike stopped 3 strides away. He was 6'4", 260 pounds, with a beard like a fist and a leather vest patched with skulls. He looked like the thing nightmares are made of, but he didn't move another inch. He just stood there in the rain, letting the water drip off his sunglasses, and when he spoke, his voice was the lowest rumble Caleb had ever heard, a voice that seemed to come up from the ground itself. "Easy, little man. We ain't here to hurt you. Heard what you said to your mama." Caleb's arms didn't drop. He didn't blink. "Nobody hears," he whispered. "I heard," said Big Mike. "My brothers heard. And we reckon nobody's supposed to have to say that twice, so we're gonna make sure you don't have to say it again. What's your name?" "Caleb." "Caleb, I'm Mike. That's Smoke and that's Doc. We're gonna figure this thing out. But first, you and your mama need to get out of this rain." Caleb looked down at his mother. Tanya's eyes were wet, whether from the drizzle or emotion, it was impossible to tell. She made a sound, a low, guttural note that only her son could translate. He turned back to the giant. "She wants to know if you're really going to help or if you're just saying it." Big Mike knelt. Not knelt like a man bending down to tie a shoe, but knelt like a knight, one knee on the cold, wet ground, bringing his face level with the boy. His knee touched the cardboard sign. He didn't seem to notice. "Caleb, I give you my word on my daughter's life. You understand what that means. I'm a Hell's Angel. My word is the one thing nobody gets to take. Now let us help you." The boy's chin trembled. For the first time in over a year, the wall he'd built around himself cracked. He nodded, and then his arms fell, and he turned and wrapped himself around his mother's shoulder, sobbing once hard. Smoke and Doc came forward, slow, as if approaching wounded animals. Doc knelt beside the wheelchair and started asking Tanya questions in a low, gentle tone. "When's the last time you ate, ma'am? Can you tell me what medications you're on?" Smoke pulled off his heavy leather coat and draped it over the woman's lap without a word. They moved the whole operation inside Angelo's shop. Angelo himself, a wiry Italian with a permanent scowl, saw them coming, rolled his eyes, and then bustled off to find clean rags and heat up soup from the back office. Over the next hour, the whole story spilled out, piece by broken piece. Caleb did most of the talking, his voice flat, reciting facts like a police report. The stroke, a hemorrhagic bleed that hit on a Tuesday morning while she was scrambling eggs. The ambulance, the rehab, the homecoming that was supposed to be hopeful. Then the eviction notice from Frank DeMarco, the landlord who'd never liked them, who'd called the ambulance visits a nuisance and threatened to tow the wheelchair ramp they'd propped against the front steps. The father, a man named Darnell, who'd promised to stay and then left a note in an empty closet. The miles of pushing that wheelchair. The nights sleeping in bus shelters and laundromat porches. The day a social worker offered to place Caleb in foster care and Tanya in a state facility, separate, and how Caleb had screamed until the woman left. The day their food stamps ran out and he ate from a dumpster. The cold, endless, indifferent machinery of a world that had decided two human beings were simply too much trouble. Big Mike listened in silence, his jaw working like he was chewing on something that tasted like rust. When Caleb got to the part about the teenager kicking the sign, Smoke let out a breath that was half a curse and half a prayer. Doc, the medic, had Tanya's vitals taken and was gently cataloging her medical needs. He looked up at Mike and shook his head once slowly. "She needs consistent care, boss. PT, med management, a home aide. Without it, she'll end up back in the hospital within a month." Big Mike stood, his boots heavy on the concrete. "All right. First things first. We get them a room at the motel tonight. Tomorrow, I start making calls." That night, in a motel room that smelled of bleach and old carpet, Caleb tucked his mother into a real bed for the first time in weeks. He still slept on the floor beside her, curled up on a pile of extra blankets because he didn't know how to sleep any other way. But when Big Mike stopped by with a bag of burgers and saw the boy on the floor, he just looked at Smoke. The next morning, a cot appeared, brand new, with clean sheets. No receipt, no note. Big Mike's calls changed everything. He owned a construction company in Oakland, and over the years he'd built a network that stretched across half the country, men who owed him favors or shared his code. Within 48 hours, He'd located a ground-floor, wheelchair-accessible apartment in a quiet complex 2 towns over, negotiated a year's lease paid in full at a reduced rate, and dispatched a crew to install grab bars, a ramp, and a roll-in shower. Smoke, whose real name was David, was a master electrician. He rewired the place for medical equipment and installed an emergency call system. Doc navigated the labyrinth of Medicaid and county waivers, pulling strings to fast-track Tanya's approval for in-home supportive services. By the end of the week, a certified nursing assistant named Mrs. Delgado started showing up every morning, and Caleb, for the first time in a year, was told to go be a kid. But there was one more frontier. School. Caleb had missed so much that he'd been automatically withdrawn from the 5th grade. Getting him re-enrolled required a parent or guardian. Tanya, despite her condition, was still legally his guardian, but the district office wanted proof of residency, updated immunizations, and an in-person meeting. So on a gray Thursday, Big Mike, Smoke, and Doc walked Caleb into the district administration building. The receptionist took one look at the 3 leather-clad men and reached for the panic button under her desk. The principal, a thin man named Mr. Ellison, came out with his hand extended like a crossing guard stopping traffic, his gaze darting to the patches and tattoos. "Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to state your business here." Mike placed a thick folder on the counter. "We're here to get this boy back in school." That folder has his birth certificate, his immunization record, a lease showing his new address, and a signed medical consent from his mother, who is waiting outside in the van. "We are not his guardians. We are his backup. Now you can process the paperwork, or you can explain to the district superintendent why you denied enrollment to a child based on the way his advocates dress." Ellison blinked, opened the folder, and processed the paperwork. Caleb started 5th grade the following Monday. Just as the family began to believe that stability was possible, a new threat emerged from the shadows, one that would test the resolve of everyone involved and eventually summon an army. Tanya had a sister, Denise, who had cut off contact after the stroke, claiming the whole situation was too painful to watch. But the moment she learned, through a forwarded piece of mail, that Tanya was receiving disability payments, and that Caleb might qualify for survivor benefits since his father's disappearance had been officially ruled abandonment, Denise saw an opportunity. She showed up at the apartment one afternoon while the men were out, demanding to see her sister. Mrs. Delgado, the nursing assistant, refused to let her in. The next day, Denise filed an emergency petition for guardianship of Caleb, alleging that he was living in an unsafe environment surrounded by gang members. A court date was set. The news hit like a body blow. Tanya, who could barely form whole sentences, wept in her wheelchair. Caleb didn't cry. He just sat on his cot, staring at the wall, his face going blank in a way that scared Doc more than any outburst could. Big Mike got on the phone with a lawyer he knew, a former public defender named Gloria Jimenez, who'd once represented his cousin and owed him a solid. She agreed to take the case pro bono and began gathering evidence: documentation of the biker's support, testimony from Mrs. Delgado, photos of the newly renovated apartment, and crucially, a paper trail showing that Denise had never once visited Tanya in the hospital or assisted during the year of homelessness. The hearing was held in a small family courtroom with wood-paneled walls and a judge who looked like he'd seen everything and believed nothing. Denise, in a cheap blazer and a rehearsed sob story, painted herself as a concerned aunt rescuing a child from a den of criminals. Gloria systematically dismantled her, introducing time-stamped photos of Caleb sleeping in doorways while Denise's social media showed her vacationing in Cancun. Then Big Mike took the stand. He wore his cut, his rockers, his ink. He stated his full name, his rank, his years of service as a sergeant in the Marine Corps, his ownership of a licensed contracting business. He explained, slowly and without rancor, how he'd met a boy in the rain who was fighting alone, and how he'd made a promise. The judge listened, asked no questions, and then ruled from the bench. The petition was denied with prejudice. Denise was admonished for wasting the court's time, and Caleb would remain with his mother, with the bikers granted formal status as family, friends, and support network. Outside the courthouse, Denise screamed at the bikers, threatening to call Child Protective Services, threatening to make their lives hell. She stabbed a finger at Big Mike and hissed, "You think you've won? I know people. I'll have that boy in state care before you can blink." Then she stormed off. Smoke watched her go, his hands clenching and unclenching. Doc looked at Mike. "She's going to be a problem." Big Mike pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact. He stepped away, spoke for 5 minutes. When he came back, his face was set. He just said, "It's handled," but something in his tone told the others that the battle was only beginning. 3 days later, the first bikes arrived. They came not in a parade, but in small groups of 2 and 3, filtering into town from every direction, rumbling into the parking lot of the apartment complex like a low, steady thunder. By noon, there were 60 Hell's Angels lined up, engines idling, leather vests shining in the cold autumn sun, a wall of iron, and were prepared to stand watch over a family that the world had thrown away. The rumble of 60 engines cut through the thin walls of the apartment complex like a seismic announcement. Curtains twitched, faces appeared in windows and then vanished. Mrs. Delgado, the nursing assistant, came to the door and stood frozen for a full 10 seconds before Caleb pushed past her, his eyes wide. He'd never seen anything like it. In the parking lot, the line of Harleys stretched from one end of the building to the other, chrome and black leather gleaming after the rain. Big Mike sat at the head of the column on his custom Road King, engine ticking, arms folded across his chest like a general surveying a conquered field. He caught Caleb's eye and gave him a single nod. The message was unmistakable. "This is your army now." For 3 days, the bikers maintained a rotating guard. 2 men at the apartment door, 2 at the back entrance, 4 patrolling the perimeter in shifts. They brought groceries, fixed a leaking pipe under the bathroom sink, and played catch with Caleb on the patch of grass by the dumpster. The neighbors who had once averted their eyes suddenly became very curious. Some complained to the management office about the noise and the intimidating presence. The apartment manager, a harried woman named Brenda, threatened to call the police until Smoke sat down with her and calmly explained the situation. A disabled woman and her child were being harassed by a relative who had already been admonished by a judge, and the men outside were simply ensuring their safety. He also paid the next 3 months, rent in cash, and handed her a business card for his electrical company, offering free labor on any maintenance issues. Brenda stopped complaining. Denise, however, did not stop. 2 days after the bikers arrived, a county social worker named Ms. Patterson knocked on Tanya's door. She carried a clipboard and a file with a red sticker that said urgent. The complaint, filed anonymously but unmistakably from Denise, alleged that Tanya was medically incapacitated and unable to care for a minor, that the boy was living in a biker clubhouse, and that drug activity was suspected. Ms. Patterson, a weary woman with 30 years of seeing the worst humanity had to offer, stepped into the apartment expecting to find squalor. Instead, she found clean floors, a stocked refrigerator, a new wheelchair ramp, and a 10-year-old boy doing his math homework at the kitchen table, while a home health aide helped his mother with her physical therapy exercises. She found a binder on the counter, prepared by Doc, containing Tanya's complete medical history, her treatment plan, her care schedule, and letters from 2 physicians attesting to her mental competency. She found Big Mike, who stood in the corner like a piece of furniture, and said, "Ma'am, ask whatever you need to ask," she asked. For 3 hours, she interviewed Tanya through a speech-to-text device that Doc had rigged from an old tablet, interviewed Caleb with a child psychologist present via video call, and reviewed every piece of documentation. By the end, she closed her file and said, "This is the cleanest home I've seen all year. I'm closing the investigation." Then she looked at Big Mike and added quietly, "Off the record, a lot of folks in my office are still scared of men who look like you. But you've done more for this family than any system ever did." But Denise had one more card to play. A week later, the school board held a special meeting to address an emergency guardianship claim filed by her, this time directly with the district, asserting that Caleb's educational welfare was in jeopardy because he was living with known gang members. The board, already skittish after rumors of bikers swirled through the PTA, summoned Caleb's mother and guardians to appear and explain why the boy should not be placed in temporary foster care. Notice arrived on a Friday, the meeting set for Monday night. The school boardroom was small and overheated, with fluorescent lights that hummed and a row of officials sitting behind a long laminate table. Denise sat in the front row, flanked by a cousin and a woman from a church she'd attended twice. She had dressed carefully, a modest blouse and a gold cross, and she wept on cue as she described her poor disabled sister being exploited by criminals. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Then the doors at the back of the room swung open. 60 Hell's Angels didn't fit into a school boardroom. 20 did, and they filled the back 2 rows like a wall of leather and silence. The rest waited outside, engines off, standing next to their bikes under the parking lot lights. Big Mike walked up the center aisle with Gloria Jimenez at his side, the same lawyer who dismantled Denise in family court. He sat down in the front row, directly across from Denise, and removed his sunglasses. His face, gravel and calm, made the board president swallow audibly. Gloria spoke first, submitting a binder twice as thick as the one given to CPS. Proof of guardianship status, character affidavits from 3 Marines who'd served with Mike, letters from Tanya's doctors, a copy of the dismissed court case, and a notarized statement from Ms. Patterson, the social worker, recommending no state intervention. Then Big Mike stood. He didn't raise his voice. He told the board about the rain, about the boy with the cardboard sign, about the whispered words, "No one helps us." He told them about his daughter, about his code, about the dignity of a woman who'd been evicted for having a stroke. And then he said, "You're all here debating whether a child is safe with us. But where were you when he was sleeping in a bus shelter? Where were you when his father vanished and his mother couldn't walk? We are not the threat in this room. The threat is a system that abandons its most vulnerable and then punishes the only people who show up." He sat down. The silence lasted 10 full seconds. The board voted unanimously to dismiss the claim. Denise fled the room amid a rustle of whispers, her face twisted with fury. Outside, the line of Harleys roared to life in a unified salute that echoed across town. But something else happened that night, something nobody in that room could have anticipated. A local reporter, a young woman from the town paper who'd come to cover the biker scare, had recorded Big Mike's speech on her phone. She filed a story not about fear, but about mercy. By morning, the article had been picked up by the state wire. By the end of the week, the national news had called. Cameras appeared outside the apartment. Donations poured in. A foundation for children's medical advocacy offered Caleb a full scholarship to any school he chose. And the Hells Angels, the outlaws everyone had crossed the street to avoid, became the quiet, unlikely center of a story that was about to rewrite not just 2 lives, but the way an entire community saw itself. The national spotlight burned white-hot for 2 weeks. Cameras camped outside the apartment. Morning shows called. A crowdfunding page, started by a stranger in Ohio, raised over $200,000 before the bikers stepped in and shut it down. Big Mike's logic was simple. The family didn't need pity money. They needed a permanent foundation. Every donated cent was rolled into a trust, managed by Gloria Jimenez with 3 ironclad rules. It could only be used for Tanya's medical care, Caleb's education, and a single-family home. Within a month, a modest 3-bedroom house on a quiet cul-de-sac was purchased outright. Its entryways widened, its bathrooms retrofitted. The Hells Angels did the renovations themselves. But the real transformation wasn't in the drywall. It was in the quiet. That first morning in the new house, Caleb woke up in his own bedroom, a real bedroom with a desk and a window that overlooked a maple tree, and he didn't immediately check to see if his mother was still breathing. For a year, his body had been wired for crisis. Now, a stillness settled into his shoulders that no one had seen since before the stroke. Mrs. Delgado continued her visits, but now Tanya was improving. Twice weekly physical therapy had brought back a flicker of movement in her left leg, and the speech-to-text tablet had become a secondary tool because she could now whisper whole sentences. The first time she said, "I love you, baby," clearly enough for Caleb to hear without leaning in, he buried his face in her shoulder and didn't let go for 10 minutes. The bikers never left. They simply shifted from crisis mode to permanence. A schedule materialized on the refrigerator, written in Doc's neat block print. Monday groceries, Thursday homework help, Saturday yard work. Smoke installed a swing set in the backyard. Another member, a man they called Tiny, who was anything but, showed up every Wednesday to teach Caleb how to work on old motorcycle engines, using a rusted Honda CB that was, according to Tiny, the best teacher a man can have. Caleb, who'd missed so much school that fractions had felt like a foreign language, caught up in 6 months and then surged ahead, his math skills sharpened by the mechanic's lessons. The town, too, began to shift. The same neighbors who'd once pulled their curtains back now brought casseroles. The manager at the laundromat, the very one where Caleb and Tanya had huddled under the overhang, put a framed photo of the family on the wall with a caption, "Everyone is welcome." The police chief, embarrassed by the earlier move-along order, instituted a new community policing program that trained officers to connect homeless families with resources instead of shooing them away. Nothing erases old failures, but the air changed. And the gatekeepers kept their gate. When a tabloid reporter tried to ambush Tanya outside a doctor's appointment, 2 bikers materialized so smoothly that the reporter found himself back in his car without quite knowing how he got there. When Denise made one last desperate attempt, filing a complaint with the state attorney general's office, alleging financial exploitation, the probe lasted less than 48 hours. The investigator reviewed the trust documents, interviewed the family, and closed the case with a note. No exploitation found. This family is protected by a network more accountable than any government agency. Then came the moment nobody saw coming. On a Thursday afternoon in late spring, a dented sedan pulled up to the curb. The man who got out was thinner than anyone remembered, his clothes rumpled, his eyes hollow. Darnell, the father who had vanished 2 years earlier. He'd seen the news. He'd heard about the house, the trust fund, the scholarship. He stood on the sidewalk, clutching a gas station bouquet, rehearsing a speech about regret and redemption. He never made it to the door. Big Mike was in the front yard, teaching Caleb how to throw a curveball. He saw the car, saw the man, and set the glove down. He walked to the curb without a word, his bulk blocking the path. Darnell started to speak. "I just want to see my son," and Mike raised one hand gently, the same gesture he'd used in the rain. His voice was low and calm. "You don't get to do that, not today, not like this. If you want to prove you've changed, you start with the court. You start with a letter. You don't show up unannounced and expect a child to swallow his hurt because you brought flowers." Darnell's face crumpled. He dropped the bouquet on the grass and drove away. Caleb watched from the yard, the baseball still in his hand. He didn't cry. He didn't run after the car. He just looked at Mike and said, "Is he coming back?" Mike knelt, the same way he had 2 years earlier, his knee on the grass. "Only if you want him to, little man, and not 1 second before." That night at the kitchen table, Caleb wrote his father a letter. It was 2 sentences long. He sealed it, handed it to Gloria, and never asked about it again. The gate had held. The family, this chosen, stitched-together, improbable family, remained intact. And the boy who once whispered into the rain that no one helps us finally understood that help doesn't always come wrapped in the shape you expect. Sometimes it comes in leather, in chrome, in 60 men who heard a whisper and decided the world had been silent long enough. The thing that stays with me isn't the 60 bikes, the courtroom victories, or even the house. It's the whisper. A child's voice so small the rain almost swallowed it. "No one helps us." He wasn't wrong. For a year no one did. Not the neighbors, not the system, not the father who walked away. The world had 1,000 chances to open a door and it kept them all closed. Until 3 men in leather heard 4 words through a gap in a wall and decided that their fear of looking dangerous was less important than a boy's fear of losing his mother. That's the uncomfortable question, isn't it? We all like to think we'd be the ones who stop, the ones who kneel. But how many times have we crossed the street, averted our eyes, told ourselves a story about someone based on how they looked? These men were everything society teaches us to fear: tattoos, beards, patches. And they were the only ones who listened. The truth is, mercy rarely wears a suit. It doesn't sit on committees or wait for permission. It shows up in the rain, smelling of engine grease, and it kneels. It asks questions instead of making assumptions. It builds ramps and funds trusts and stands guard at school board meetings. It throws a curveball in the front yard and tells an absent father not today. So I'll leave you with this. Somewhere near you right now, someone is whispering their own version of those words. Maybe not out loud, maybe just with their eyes. The only thing that matters is who's close enough to hear and brave enough to act. If this story moved you, share it. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, would you have been the seventh door? And subscribe so the next story finds you. Because the world has plenty of people who look away. What it needs is more who kneel.